The alarm clock read 4:17 in the morning, when the first V1 flying bomb cut through the darkness above London. Margaret Hayes woke to a sound she would never forget. A mechanical buzz, like an angry hornet, magnified 1,000 times, growing louder with each passing second. She sat up in bed, her husband Thomas already awake beside her, both frozen in the terrible understanding of what was coming. The noise grew unbearable, filling every corner of their small bedroom in Bethnal Green, rattling the window panes, making the walls vibrate. Then, suddenly, silence. The engine had cut out. Margaret grabbed Thomas's hand, squeezing hard enough to hurt. They had 5 seconds, maybe 10. The explosion, when it came, felt like the entire world had been struck by a giant fist. The row of terraced houses 3 streets over simply ceased to exist, replaced by a crater 20 feet deep and a cloud of brick dust that rose into the dawn sky like a funeral shroud. Margaret and Thomas stumbled into the street along with their neighbors, everyone in nightclothes, faces pale with shock. The scene that greeted them belonged in hell. Where homes had stood moments before, there was nothing but twisted metal, shattered wood, and flames climbing into the morning air. A woman named Anna Fisher emerged from the smoke, barefoot and bleeding from a cut above her eye, her nightgown torn and covered in gray dust. She was calling a name over and over, David, her younger brother, who lived 2 doors down from the impact site. Rescue workers were already arriving, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they would find. Anna refused to leave, clawing at rubble with her bare hands until someone pulled her away. By the time the sun rose fully, 17 bodies had been recovered. David Fisher was the 11th. This was not an isolated incident. This was the new reality. Over the next 7 days, 143 V1 flying bombs struck London and the surrounding areas. Each one carried 1,870 pounds of high explosive in its nose, designed to detonate on impact and maximize destruction. The city's defenses scrambled desperately to respond. Royal Air Force fighter pilots chased the bombs through the sky, trying to shoot them down or tip their wings to send them off course before they reached populated areas. Anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of shells, filling the air with shrapnel and smoke. Barrage balloons dotted the skyline, massive silver obstacles meant to snag incoming missiles in their cables. Despite all these efforts, the bombs kept coming. On June 15th, a single V1 struck the Guards' Chapel at Wellington Barracks during Sunday morning service. 121 people died instantly, buried under tons of collapsing masonry. The congregation had been singing hymns when the roof came down. London transformed into a city of fractured routines and constant fear. Families made impossible calculations. Parents debated whether to send their children to the countryside, knowing that separation might become permanent if another wave of bombings followed. Some households split themselves deliberately, mothers staying in one district, fathers in another, children sent to relatives in distant towns, so that no single bomb could wipe out an entire bloodline. The underground stations, once refugees during the Blitz, filled again each night with people carrying blankets and small suitcases, trying to sleep on cold platforms, while trains rumbled past. Shops opened irregularly, their owners exhausted from sleepless nights. Schools held classes in basements. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, doctors and nurses working 18-hour shifts, running out of bandages and morphine. The psychological toll was immense. People flinched at every distant sound, every car backfire, every door slamming shut. The constant tension wore away at sanity, leaving even the strongest individuals hollow-eyed and shaking. In Whitehall, behind closed doors and guarded by armed sentries, the War Cabinet convened in emergency session. The long table was covered with maps, reconnaissance photographs, and intelligence reports stamped with red classifications. Winston Churchill sat at the head, cigar unlit, his face heavy with exhaustion and anger. Around him, military commanders and intelligence chiefs argued in heated tones about how to respond. The head of Bomber Command advocated for increased raids on suspected launch sites in France and the Low Countries. But reconnaissance showed the Germans were using mobile launchers, moving them constantly to avoid detection. Even when Allied bombers found a site and destroyed it, new launchers appeared within days. The air marshal pounded his fist on the table, insisting that saturation bombing was the only answer. Others disagreed, pointing out that civilian casualties in occupied territories were already mounting, and the French resistance was protesting the collateral damage. Then came the report that silenced the room. An MI6 liaison officer, his uniform crisp but his face pale, delivered the latest intelligence from agents operating inside occupied Europe. The V-1 was not the final weapon. Germany had already completed development of a far more advanced missile, designated the V-2. Unlike the flying bomb, which could be tracked and sometimes intercepted, the V-2 was a true ballistic missile. It launched vertically, climbing to the edge of space before descending at speeds exceeding 3,000 miles per hour, faster than sound itself. There was no warning, no buzzing engine to signal its approach, no chance for interception. One moment, a street existed. The next, it was gone, obliterated by a ton of explosives arriving without warning. The first test launches had already occurred. Production facilities were hidden deep underground in massive complexes carved into mountains, protected by reinforced concrete and guarded by SS detachments and Gestapo units. Conventional bombing was proving almost useless against these sites. Even direct hits barely scratched the surface. Churchill listened to all of this in silence, his expression unreadable. When the room finally quieted, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice. He reminded them that London had endured the Blitz, that the British people had survived night after night of firebombing and destruction. But this was different. This was systematic, relentless, and increasingly sophisticated. If the V-2 entered full production and deployment, if thousands of these unstoppable missiles began raining down on British cities, the calculus of the war could shift. Morale, already fragile, might collapse entirely. Evacuation of London itself might become necessary. An unthinkable humiliation. He demanded options, real options, not just more bombing raids that accomplished little. The room fell silent again. No one had an answer. That silence was broken by Harold Douglas. He was not a general or an admiral. He was the head of technical intelligence for MI6, a man in his early 40s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses, more at home in laboratories and workshops than war rooms. His colleagues considered him brilliant, but dangerously unconventional, the kind of man who proposed ideas that either solved impossible problems or ended careers. Douglas stood up slowly, adjusting his glasses, and began speaking in a calm, measured tone that somehow cut through the tension. He said that every previous attempt to stop German superweapons had focused on external destruction, bombing factories, sabotaging supply lines, killing key scientists. All of these approaches shared a fundamental flaw. They were visible. They provoked responses. They forced the Germans to adapt, to rebuild, to increase security. Douglas proposed something entirely different. Instead of attacking from outside, he wanted to sabotage from within, not with explosives or assassinations, but with precision, subtlety, and patience. His plan was simple in concept, but staggering in complexity. British intelligence would identify and recruit individuals already inside or capable of infiltrating German weapons factories. Forced laborers, anti-Nazi sympathizers, engineers with access to production lines. These operatives would not blow anything up. Instead, they would introduce microscopic flaws into the manufacturing process. A blueprint altered by 1/10 of a millimeter. A metal alloy swapped for one that looked identical, but had slightly different thermal properties. A weld performed at the wrong temperature, creating invisible structural weaknesses. An electrical component wired with a nearly undetectable error. Each individual change would be too small to notice during inspection, but collectively, they would cause catastrophic failure rates. Rockets would explode on launch pads. Guidance systems would malfunction mid-flight. Fuel pumps would fail. Missiles would veer off course and crash into the ocean. And critically, the Germans would not understand why. They would suspect sabotage, certainly, but they would not be able to prove it. They would investigate, execute suspects, increase security. But the failures would continue, because the sabotage was already embedded in the weapons themselves. The room erupted. Several officers shouted that it was impossible, that no agent could survive long enough inside a German facility to accomplish such work, that the Gestapo would uncover them within days. The head of SOE, the Special Operations Executive, argued that his teams were already conducting sabotage missions across Europe, and questioned whether this new approach was worth diverting resources. Douglas remained calm. He acknowledged the risks, but pointed out that traditional sabotage missions had limited impact. Blowing up a factory killed workers and destroyed equipment. But the Germans rebuilt. Killing a scientist delayed a project, but others took their place. What he proposed was systemic corruption of the weapons themselves, impossible to fix, because the Germans would not know what to fix. He also noted that they already had assets in place: forced laborers from occupied countries, prisoners of war working in German factories, German anti-fascists willing to risk everything. The infrastructure existed. What was needed was coordination, training, and authorization to act. Churchill raised his hand, and the room fell silent again. He asked Douglas a single question. Could this plan save London? Douglas did not hesitate. He said yes. If executed properly, if operatives could be placed in key facilities, if sabotage could be sustained over weeks and months, failure rates for V-1 and V-2 missiles could be driven so high that German production effectively became useless. Instead of 10,000 functional weapons, Germany might only deploy 2,000 or 3,000. Instead of overwhelming British defenses, the attacks would remain manageable. Thousands of lives would be saved. Churchill studied Douglas for a long moment, then nodded once. The operation was authorized. It would be given a code name, Operation Gremlin, after the mythical creature's pilots blamed for unexplained mechanical failures. The mission would remain classified at the highest levels. Even Allied commanders would not know the full scope. If agents were captured, they would be disavowed. There would be no recognition, no medals, no acknowledgement. This was a war fought in shadows, where victories would be measured in silent failures and lives never lost. Within 48 hours, MI6 began activating its network. Recruitment focused on individuals with specific skill sets: machinists, welders, electrical engineers, quality control inspectors, anyone with technical expertise and access to German facilities. Among the first volunteers was Anna Fischer. After her brother's death, she had tried to continue her normal life, returning to her job as a precision machinist in a London munitions factory. But the grief consumed her. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not stop seeing David's face. When an MI6 recruiter approached her quietly one evening explaining that there was a way to fight back, a way to make the weapons fail before they killed others, she agreed immediately. She did not care about the danger. She did not care that she might never return. She cared only that her brother's death would mean something. Her training began in a converted barn outside Cambridge, under Douglas's direct supervision. She learned to speak flawless German, to memorize cover stories so thoroughly that they became second nature, to recognize technical drawings and identify critical stress points in mechanical systems. She was taught how to introduce flaws that would pass inspection, how to file down a metal component just enough to weaken it without changing its appearance, how to contaminate an alloy batch with trace elements that would cause failure under heat, how to rewire a circuit in a way that would function normally during testing, but fail catastrophically under operational stress. She learned interrogation resistance, how to withstand pain without breaking, how to swallow a cyanide capsule if capture became inevitable. By December, as snow began falling across England, Anna Fischer was no longer a grieving sister. She was a weapon aimed directly at the heart of the German war machine. Operation Gremlin was ready to begin. The farmhouse outside Cambridge looked abandoned from the road. Its windows were boarded up, paint peeling from the wooden shutters, the front gate hanging loose on rusted hinges. But behind those walls, in a converted barn lit by kerosene lamps and heated by a single coal stove, Anna Fischer was being transformed into someone else entirely. Her instructor was a German-born MI6 officer named Klaus Brenner, a man who had fled Berlin in 1938 after the Gestapo murdered his wife for distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets. Brenner did not believe in gentle training. On Anna's first morning, he woke her at 4 by overturning her cot, sending her crashing to the frozen floor. Before she could protest, he was shouting in rapid German, demanding to know her name, her papers, her purpose. She stammered in English, still disoriented. He slapped her hard across the face. Again in German. "Who are you?" Anna felt rage flooding through her, but she forced herself to answer this time in German, using the cover identity she had memorized. Brenner nodded once, then walked away without another word. This was lesson 1. In Germany, there would be no second chances. Over the following weeks, Anna learned to become Anneliese Hoffmann, a widow from Leipzig whose husband had died on the Eastern Front. She memorized every street in Leipzig, the names of local shopkeepers, the layout of the train station, the location of the nearest Gestapo headquarters. She practiced her signature until it became automatic, identical every time. She studied photographs of her fictional husband until she could describe his face in intimate detail. The scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the way he smiled with only one side of his mouth. Brenner tested her relentlessly, appearing without warning at odd hours to interrogate her, sometimes gently, sometimes with screaming threats. He forced her to maintain her cover story while sleep-deprived, while cold, while in pain. Once he locked her in a freezing shed for 6 hours, then burst in with 2 other instructors, pretending to be Gestapo agents. They accused her of being a British spy, showed her forged evidence, promised her life if she confessed. Anna did not break. When Brenner finally released her, he said nothing, but she saw something shift in his eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of what she was becoming. The technical training was even more demanding. Harold Douglas himself arrived at the farmhouse to oversee this phase, bringing with him crates of German engineering manuals, technical drawings, and actual components salvaged from downed V-1 missiles. Anna had worked as a machinist before the war, so she understood precision manufacturing, but Douglas pushed her far beyond that. He taught her to read advanced blueprints, to identify critical stress points in complex mechanical systems, to recognize the difference between various metal alloys by sight and touch. He showed her a fuel pump from a V1, disassembling it piece by piece while explaining how each component functioned. Then he pointed to a single valve no larger than Anna's thumb. If this valve is manufactured even 2 millimeters out of specification, he explained, the fuel flow becomes irregular. The engine runs rough. Sometimes it fails entirely mid-flight. The missile crashes into the sea. But during factory inspection, the valve looks perfect. Only under operational stress does the flaw reveal itself. Douglas handed Anna a set of precision tools and a blank piece of steel. He told her to manufacture a replica of that valve, but with the flaw built in. She worked for 3 hours, measuring, cutting, filing, checking her work with calipers. When she finished, Douglas examined it under magnification, then nodded. Good, but not good enough. A truly skilled German inspector might catch this. Do it again. Make the flaw invisible. Anna repeated the exercise 7 times before Douglas was satisfied. This, he said, is what will save lives. Not explosions, not heroics, just this. A valve that looks flawless but fails at 30,000 feet. She understood then the true nature of Operation Gremlin. It was not sabotage as she had imagined it. It was corruption. A slow, invisible poison introduced into the German war machine, undetectable until it was far too late. While Anna trained in England, other operatives were already moving into position across occupied Europe. In France, a Belgian engineer named Marcel Dubois had been conscripted into forced labor at a German aircraft factory near Paris. Marcel was 47 years old, with thick glasses and arthritic hands, exactly the kind of man the Gestapo would overlook. What they did not know was that Marcel had spent 20 years designing precision instruments for the French military before the invasion. MI6 had contacted him through the resistance, offering him a chance to fight back. Marcel accepted immediately. His daughter had been killed during the initial German assault on France, and he had nothing left but hatred. His role in Operation Gremlin was to sabotage gyroscopes, the delicate devices that kept V-1 missiles flying straight. A gyroscope was a marvel of engineering, a spinning wheel mounted in gimbals, maintaining orientation through pure physics. Even the slightest imbalance would cause drift. Marcel's job was to introduce that imbalance during manufacturing, in ways that no inspection could detect. He began his work carefully, identifying which inspectors were lazy, which shifts had the weakest oversight, which components moved through quality control with minimal scrutiny. Then, during a night shift in early January, Marcel made his first alteration. He was assembling a gyroscope housing, a task he had performed hundreds of times. But this time, he deliberately misaligned one of the internal bearings by a fraction of a degree. The gyroscope spun perfectly on the test bench. It passed inspection. It was installed in a V-1 missile and shipped to a launch site in northern France. 3 weeks later, that missile was fired toward London. It climbed to altitude, its engine roaring, tracking toward the city. But the misaligned bearing caused the gyroscope to drift. Slowly at first, then faster. The missile's guidance system tried to compensate, but the drift accelerated. 20 miles from London, the V-1 veered sharply to the south, its trajectory completely lost. It crashed into empty farmland, detonating in a field of frozen mud. No one was hurt. No one except Marcel would ever know why it failed. In Germany itself, the infiltration was far more dangerous. A young Polish woman named Kasia Nowak had been taken from her home in Warsaw and sent to work at the Mittelwerk factory, a massive underground complex carved into a mountain in central Germany. Mittelwerk was where the V-2 rockets were assembled, a nightmarish place staffed almost entirely by slave laborers, prisoners of war, political prisoners, Jews. The conditions were unimaginable. Workers died daily from exhaustion, malnutrition, and brutal beatings by SS guards. Bodies were removed from the tunnels each morning and replaced with new prisoners. Kasia had survived 3 months in this hell, and she had learned to be invisible. She was small, quiet, and appeared weak. The guards ignored her. But Kasia was not weak. Before her arrest, she had been a university student studying electrical engineering. MI6 had reached her through a Polish underground network operating inside the camp, offering her a way to strike back if she was willing to risk everything. She was. Kasia's specialty became electrical systems. The V-2 was an incredibly complex machine, requiring hundreds of electrical connections to function. Guidance computers, ignition systems, fuel controls. A single miswired connection could cause catastrophic failure, but only if done correctly. If the sabotage was too obvious, it would be caught during pre-launch testing. Kasia learned to introduce errors that would not appear until the rocket was already in flight. She would swap 2 nearly identical wires in a guidance circuit, creating a connection that worked perfectly under low voltage but failed under the high voltage generated during launch. Or she would use a soldering iron at slightly too high a temperature, creating a joint that looked solid but contained microscopic fractures. These fractures would hold during testing, but break apart under the intense vibration of a rocket launch. The missile would lift off, climb majestically into the sky, then suddenly lose guidance and tumble out of control. The risks Kasia faced were staggering. The SS conducted random inspections constantly, looking for sabotage. Anyone caught was hanged immediately in front of the other workers as an example. Kasia had watched at least a dozen executions since arriving at Mittelwerk, including one man accused of deliberately damaging a fuel line. He had been innocent. The damage was accidental, but the SS did not care. They strung him up from a steel beam and left his body hanging for 3 days. Kasia worked in the shadow of that corpse, her hands steady, her face expressionless, introducing flaw after flaw into the rockets that would carry Hitler's vengeance toward England. She did not think about the danger. She thought only about her family, murdered during the Warsaw Uprising, and about the satisfaction of knowing that each failed rocket was a small victory against the men who had destroyed her world. Back in England, Harold Douglas coordinated the entire operation from a small office in an unmarked building near Westminster. He received coded reports from agents across Europe, tracking which factories were being successfully infiltrated, which types of sabotage were proving most effective, which operatives were still safe. The reports came through multiple channels: resistance couriers, clandestine radio transmissions, even messages hidden in German bureaucratic paperwork, intercepted by British intelligence. Douglas compiled this information into charts and graphs, analyzing failure rates for V1 and V2 weapons. The results were encouraging but inconsistent. Some batches of missiles showed failure rates approaching 60%. Others functioned normally. Douglas realized that sabotage needed to be sustained and systematic. One or two corrupted components were not enough. The entire production process needed to be compromised. He expanded Operation Gremlin, recruiting more agents, targeting more factories. A German machinist named Otto Werner, secretly opposed to the Nazi regime, was placed inside the Peenem.NDE research facility itself, where V2 prototypes were being tested. Otto's job was to alter technical specifications in ways that would propagate through the entire production system. He would change a blueprint measurement by 1/10 of a millimeter or specify a metal alloy that was slightly weaker than required. These changes would be copied and distributed to multiple factories, corrupting hundreds of missiles. A Danish chemist named Jens Larsen, working at a fuel production plant, began contaminating batches of rocket propellant with trace impurities that reduced combustion efficiency. The rockets would launch but underperform, falling short of their targets. A French electrician named Claude Renard, forced to work at a V1 launch site, learned to sabotage the launch catapults themselves, introducing mechanical flaws that caused missiles to crash immediately after takeoff. Each agent worked alone, unaware of the others, connected only through Douglas and his small team of coordinators. This compartmentalization was essential for security. If one agent was captured and tortured, they could not betray the entire network, because they did not know it existed. But it also meant that the agents faced their missions in complete isolation, with no support, no backup, no hope of rescue if things went wrong. They lived under constant threat of discovery, knowing that a single mistake, a moment of inattention, a misplaced tool, a suspicious glance from a guard, could mean death. Yet they continued. Some were motivated by patriotism, others by revenge, others simply by the need to resist. Anna Fisher, completing her training in England, would soon join them. She did not know their names or their faces, but she understood that she was part of something larger than herself. A silent war fought in factory shadows, where victories were measured not in territory gained, but in weapons that failed to kill. In late February, Douglas summoned Anna to his office. The training was complete. She was ready. He handed her a packet of forged documents, identity papers, work permits, travel authorizations, all bearing the name Anneliese Hoffmann. Her assignment: infiltrate the Mittelwerk factory and make contact with Kasia Nowak, who would help her gain access to the V2 assembly lines. Douglas explained that Kasia was exhausted, on the edge of collapse. She needed support. Anna would provide it, taking over some of the sabotage work and allowing Kasia to survive long enough to be useful. The mission was expected to last at least 3 months, possibly longer. Extraction was uncertain. If Anna was compromised, MI6 would deny any knowledge of her existence. Douglas asked if she understood. Anna nodded. She understood perfectly. This was a one-way mission, and she was going anyway. 3 days later, under cover of darkness, a Royal Air Force aircraft dropped Anna Fisher by parachute into occupied France. She landed in a frozen field, buried her parachute and flight suit, and walked 7 miles to a resistance safe house. From there, she would begin the long, dangerous journey into the heart of Nazi Germany, carrying nothing but forged papers and a set of precision tools hidden in the lining of her coat. Behind her, in England, Harold Douglas watched reports of V1 strikes on London and waited to see if his invisible army could turn the tide. Anna Fisher's forged papers got her past the railway checkpoint at Nordhausen. But her nerves remained raw as she followed the work detachment into the mouth of the underground Mittelwerk factory. The sound inside was overwhelming, a thunder of machinery echoing through raw stone tunnels, accented by barking guards and shouted instructions in 4 different languages. Overhead, sodium lamps cast a sickly, endless glow, leaving shadows that seemed to shift with every passing figure. Anna carried her tool bag tight against her side, her fingers cold even through the coarse wool of her coat. One mistake, and she knew she would vanish like so many prisoners before her, name erased, body unmarked. Inside Mittelwerk, Anna met Kasia Nowak, not in a secret alcove but on the factory floor, both assigned to the final inspection section of V2 rocket assembly. Their first contact was marked by a silent glance, a quick exchange of tools, and a line of code whispered in Polish, passed off as technical jargon to anyone listening. Trust was immediate and absolute. There was no room for caution with so much at stake. Together, in the roaring chaos, Anna and Kasia mapped the routines. When guards changed shifts, which foreman drank too much coffee, where toolboxes could be tampered with for 5 seconds unnoticed, each risked everything with every action. Anna's first assignment came without warning. A supervisor thrust a set of blueprints at her, barking for a technical check. Her hands trembled as she realized she was meant to verify the guidance system's turbine assembly. Years of training took over. With a pencil and a brief, precisely calibrated hesitation, she altered the drawing. A decimal point, rendered as a faint smudge, a torque value, rounded just wrong enough. The part would be manufactured to her specification, flawless to any observer. But it would fail at altitude, destabilizing the guidance and sending the rocket spiraling away from its target. She penned her initials and handed back the file, heart pounding, eyes steady. Kasia's skill was subtler still. At her station, she worked with soldering iron and fine copper wire, building circuit boards for the ignition sequence. Her sabotage was measured in microns, heating the solder just a fraction too long to create invisible fractures, threading a wire beneath its insulation so the circuit would fail after 10 or 20 uses. Every action demanded perfection. Too much, and inspection would catch it. Too little, and the rocket would launch true. More than once, they watched as the SS stormed through the lines, dragging away a worker who stuttered under questioning or lingered too long near the scrap bins. Anna and Kasia kept their faces blank and their focus absolute. Failure meant death. Elsewhere in the Reich, other Gremlin operatives walked the same razor's edge. Marcel Dubois in France sabotaged V1 gyroscopes with calculated misalignments, cursing in silence as bombs he had ruined were loaded onto convoys bound for the coast. In Pinem Daras NDE, Otto Werner doctored technical bulletins, his tiny adjustments echoing through hundreds of blueprints distributed to satellite factories. Each operative worked alone, carrying their guilt and hope in private, knowing their sabotage would never be sung as heroism. At Mittelwerk, Anna's world contracted to passing hours, an endless, shifting contest of deception and split-second judgment. She learned to sleep sitting up, to feign illness at just the right moment to evade a spot inspection, to whisper instructions to Kasia, with only a look. The greatest victories were invisible. One evening, a launch manager stormed onto the floor, berating the team for a batch of V2s that had failed at ignition. Burnt wires, ruptured pumps, guidance loss. There would be punishments, he promised, perhaps executions. Instead, SS officers struck 3 unfortunate workers at random. Anna watched, face unreadable, feeling nothing but a brief, burning satisfaction that her sabotage had struck home, and regret that the innocent paid the price. Every night, Anna wrote invisible messages in the margin of the engineering shift reports, using a microdot camera borrowed from Kasia. These messages, smuggled through resistance channels, gave British intelligence hope and confirmed what London would soon see with its own eyes. The Nazi wonder weapons, so fearsome in concept, were quietly falling apart. The Gremlins were winning their silent war, one flaw, one wire, one secret act of defiance at a time. A brutal winter storm swept across northern France as Anna Fischer, disguised as Annalisa Hoffman, inspected a loaded rail convoy at the edge of a bombed-out marshalling yard. She counted the V2 rockets by the dull glow of lanterns, each missile poised for launch, each one holding the chance for slaughter and shock. 2 weeks earlier, Anna and Kasia Nowak had completed the last phase of sabotage at Mittelwerk, working side by side to introduce fatal flaws into key assemblies. Anna's mark lived in the turbine and fuel lines, a tiny deviation that would only show itself once combustion began, once the rocket was already screaming upwards. Kasia's sabotage ran beneath the polished circuits, a solder joint that would crack from vibration, a miswired connector that tricked guidance to veer off course. When the rockets launched, Anna and Kasia waited with hearts burning and hands trembling for news. The first wave struck with a sudden, fragmented chaos. One rocket malfunctioned at launch, its motor exploding in a sheet of white-hot flame that incinerated the technicians on the pad. 2 more lifted off, arced high over the channel, and fell harmlessly into the sea, trailing lines of smoke as they tumbled from the sky. A third rocket reached London, but instead of slamming into a railway station, it smashed through the roof of a church and detonated in open air, inflicting minimal damage. On the radio, Nazi commanders raged about unacceptable failures, their voices tight with panic and suspicion. The sabotage spread. In Pinem.NDE, technical officers found entire batches of guidance gyroscopes drifting wildly, with the missiles veering off trajectory by 15, sometimes 50 miles. In occupied France, launch teams reported that fuel pumps were jamming without cause, warheads rupturing mid-flight, the deadly Amitol payloads detonating prematurely, or not at all. Failure rates soared. Hitler demanded answers. Science officers blamed poor discipline, then enemy sabotage, but no single flaw explained the cascade. As the panic intensified, the SS launched brutal investigations. Innocent workers were executed on the factory floor. Their corpses hung as warnings to others. Yet for every punishment, every security increase, more V1 and V2 weapons continued to malfunction. British intelligence received coded messages. The Gremlins had sown confusion so deep, German engineers believed their superweapons cursed. Anna paused, cold and exhausted, knowing each crash, each quiet misfire, was a small redemption for London. In the chaos, a second triumph emerged. Reports filtered back that, thanks to the sabotage, Nazi high command redirected thousands of rockets away from London after faulty damage estimates. Guided by false intelligence and panicked recalibration, the Germans sent dozens of deadly rockets to empty fields and isolated villages, while the real targets endured far less destruction than predicted. Anna and Kasia's anonymized success was concealed behind the brutality of Gestapo reprisals. Each day in Mittelwerk, prisoners whispered the names of the dead, some innocent, some gremlins. But for every life lost, hundreds were spared in England and across the world. The sabotage had cracked the myth of the Nazi wonder weapon. Anna, hiding her tears, passed through yet another night on a cot 40 feet underground, clutching the knowledge that their invisible war, the wires twisted, the drawings subtly changed, had saved thousands. The Gremlins' victory echoed not in cheers, but in the silence of rockets that failed by design, and the quiet dawns of cities left standing. Anna Fisher awoke to shouting in the darkness, boots thudding overhead, the muffled roar of another V2 launch rumbling through the tunnels. Mittelwerk had become a prison inside a prison, a place where sabotage and terror walked side by side. Months had passed since she first set foot on German soil, and the names of the dead had become a litany in her memory. Some were gremlins, operatives like her and Kasia, who risked everything for one scratched wire, one misaligned valve. Most were innocent, swept away when the Gestapo's fury lashed the laborers. Anna moved through the factory by rote now, her mind partitioned into fragments. The technician whose faith had broken, the French engineer who wept quietly after sabotage rumors reached his line, the silent ones who never returned after questioning. Success meant silence. London endured the pain of rockets, but as the months dragged on, statistics shifted. Weapons failed in alarming numbers. The British intelligence chiefs received coded microdot reports. More than a third of rockets manufactured at Mittelwerk failed to launch, veered off course, or exploded midair. Gestapo officers hanged suspected saboteurs in front of the others, more than 200 by war's end. But the cycle only bred more caution, more secret acts of defiance. Anna watched as survivors shuffled by bodies left hanging for days, each corpse both a warning and, to the living, a bitter badge of honor. For Anna, for Kasia, for Marcel and Otto, and the scattered network of gremlins, the price was clear. They worked alone, cut off from family and hope, driven only by the conviction that each sabotaged weapon chipped away at the Nazi myth of invincibility. The wider world knew nothing. Their names never appeared on honors lists. Their faces faded in dim photographs or disappeared into mass graves beneath the German mountains. Anna wrote her final report in the spring of 1945, scratching the message in her smallest possible handwriting onto a slip of ration paper. When the Allies liberated Mittelwerk weeks later, she was gone, swept away by the chaos that followed, her fate unknown. The post-war world buried the story. Most gremlins were never acknowledged, their sacrifice, hidden by secrecy, classified files, and the politics of reconstruction. Years later, fragments of their work emerged, cracked blueprints, errant records, faded photographs of sabotaged missiles found in fields instead of cities. Historians pieced together the evidence, the miraculous failure rates, the patterns no accident could explain, the resistance within the very heart of the enemy's war machine. The myth of Nazi wonder weapons was forever tarnished. Anna Fischer's name was lost, but her victory remained. A victory measured not in medals, but thousands of lives saved by invisible acts of courage. In the end, the Gremlins had won their secret war, not with violence or praise, but with the quiet persistence of those who choose to resist, even when the world will never know.